right, everybody. Welcome to the Rowan College of Burlington County Global Studies Lecture Series, a continuation of a series of conversations that started in fall 2020 in global health, environment, and security and key international issues affecting those. This series is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Education's Undergraduate International Studies and Foreign Language Grant Program, a multi-year grant program with our partner institution, Rowan University, and ourselves, Rowan College, to build global and international studies designations and courses in high demand languages such as Arabic and Chinese, along with student activities reflecting these initiatives, such as the lecture series here. This event is also hosted by Rowan College, a mid-sized 2- and 3-year college in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, serving the geographically largest county in the state with anywhere from 7,000 to 9,000 students each semester. RCBC has one of the most ethnically diverse student bodies in the state and region, with one of the lowest tuition costs as well. I'm your host for this event and this series. I'm Brandon Chapman, Department Chair of Anthropology and Sociology at the college, and also the Project Director at the college of the previously mentioned grant. The goal of the lecture series is to bring to our college campus and here our virtual WebEx campus top-level scholars, academics, researchers, and industry professionals at all levels of career, early, mid, and late career that are experienced, knowledgeable experts in global health, environment, and security issues, and to develop this knowledge and skills in our students at both Rowan University and Rowan College, and to have a dynamic conversation about key global issues within these areas, and to give our students such avenues to advance their training within these topics as well. Look for more of these events in the future. In about a couple weeks or so on April 5th at 6 p.m. we'll have Hal Brands from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. I'm going to be having a discussion with him about his recent book publication on the U.S.-China relations and China military capability now and into the future. And this afternoon, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Ahmet Kuru, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies at San Diego State University in San Diego, California. Dr. Kuru specializes in political and economic development of the Islamic world, religion and secularism in political systems of Islamic nations, and democracy and authoritarianism in the Islamic world as well. He has authored numerous books and journal articles on these subjects, with his recent book, Islam, Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment, a global and historical comparison, having just co-won the American Political Science Association's International History and Politics Section Award, and was also included in the Times Literary Supplement's Books of the Year. He was a postdoctoral scholar at Columbia University, and his works have been translated into numerous languages, especially across the Islamic world as well, such as Arabic, Bosnian, Chinese, French, Indonesian, Malay, Persian, and Turkish. A note on format and agenda for the event. We will have Dr. Kuru give his talk here, and then we'll be opening up the audience for any questions. I also have several questions based on his book and what should be his talk here this afternoon to engage him in discussion. So with that, and with his talk titled Democracy and Development in the Muslim World, a Global Analysis, let's welcome Dr. Kuru to Rowan College.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brandon Chapman, and it's my honor and pleasure to be a part of this important global lecture series organized by Rowan College. And I'm happy that your students are learning big questions and their answers. And of course, the Islam question itself is relevant because today, out of 200 countries in the world, 50 of them are Muslim majority countries. And Muslims globally also constitute about 20-25% of the world population. As a political scientist, I start with a contemporary question. When I look at the Muslim majority world, I see problems. And these problems become even more interesting and puzzling when we know about Muslims' early achievements throughout their economic and intellectual progress between 8th and 11th centuries. So this puzzle let me analyze the historical origin of Muslims' early achievements and later stagnation and contemporary crisis. So let me share my PowerPoint presentation to explain what the research question is and how I approach to have a better understanding. As you said, Democracy and Development in the Muslim World, a Global Analysis is the title of today's presentation. And it's based on my book, Islam, Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment, published by Cambridge 3 years ago. I start with the alternative explanations of this puzzle. The puzzle itself has two main dimensions. One is the question of authoritarianism. As you see in this map with the green color, the Muslim majority countries are spread around various continents of Asia, Africa, Europe. Also, they exist in Southeast Asia. And although about 60% of all countries in the world are electoral democracies, according to Freedom House, in the Muslim world, the percentage is only 14%. So what explains this gap? Here, I am not comparing the Muslim world with Western countries, but instead, when we compare them with the world average, we see a big gap of democracy. Another dimension of this crisis or question is socioeconomic development. When we again compare Muslim countries with the rest of the world in terms of averages, of course, we see a gap in terms of GNI per capita, gross national income per capita, only above 9,000 in the Muslim world, whereas 13,000 in the rest or the world average. And this is despite the fact that many Muslim countries are oil rich. Despite the oil revenue, their GNI per capita is still much lower than the world average. Then when we look at the literacy rate, it's as seen in the table, 73% versus 84%. Schooling, 5.8 years versus 7.5 years. And life expectancy, 66 years versus 69 years. As I said at the beginning, when I look at this contemporary question, it makes me even more puzzled by the fact that between 8th and 12th centuries, Muslims were very successful in terms of economic growth and intellectual dynamism, as I'll elaborate later on. What explains their current crisis today? There are three main alternatives. One is what we call the essentialist claim that it's all about Islam. It is essentialist because it claims that Islam has core essence which is incompatible with development. That's the result we have. This core essence is incompatible with democracy. That's why we have authoritarianism. So throughout my book, I take this argument very seriously because many people believe in that, both in the West and also in the Muslim world. They blame Islam. But I show multiple weaknesses of this argument. For example, in the Muslim world, yes, some countries are authoritarian, many, but there are few democracies like Indonesia, Senegal, Bosnia, Albania. So therefore, it's not an authoritarian monolithic shaped by Islam per se. Second, when we ask individuals what they think about regimes in the Muslim world, 86% say they prefer democracy. And the number is almost the same of the rest of the world. 85-86% in the world says they prefer democracy. So therefore, Muslims are not automatically authoritarian. And in terms of development, as I'll explain, Muslims had 500 years of progress, development. They were much better than Western Europe. So therefore, blaming Islam is too simplistic and misleading. The almost opposite argument is to blame Western imperialism and colonization. And anti-colonialists argue that the 200 years old Western imperialism happening in the last 2 centuries is the source of all the problems. Again, I take it very seriously, engage throughout the book, and I want to briefly say that it has many weaknesses. For example, The stagnation problem in the Muslim world began earlier than colonization. Colonization is an effect that Muslims became weaker vis-a-vis Western European countries. And in the last 50, 60 years, many decolonized countries achieve either economic development, as we see in the case of Asian countries, China and others, or they achieve democratization, as we see in the case of Latin American countries, many of them decolonized, but still achieve democracy. Why not in the Middle East and other part of the Muslim world? That's the question. Last but not least, I engage with new institutionalism, and new institutionalists claim that if you have good institutions, you have democracy development. If you have bad extractive institutions, you have authoritarianism and underdevelopment. So I'm much friendlier with this argument in comparison to two other alternatives. But still, I say, what makes institutions good or bad? It is the human beings, human agency. That's missing in new institutionalist theory. And with my book and today in this presentation, I try to emphasize human agency, especially social classes, especially four social classes: political, economic, religious, and intellectual classes. In the Muslim world, so my argument is that there was a certain level of Muslim progress which make them even world leading, only competing with China on certain issues, and definitely much better than Europeans. And in this table, I define Muslim supremacy between 700 and 1200. And as you see in the table, in terms of philosophy and natural sciences, in terms of economy, and even militarily, Muslims were better than Europeans. But then the decline of the Muslim world and the rise of the West did not start immediately. No, there was about 5 century long period that I call comparable levels of development between 1200 and 1700. And after 1700, now we are experiencing the Western supremacy, scientifically, economically, militarily. So then what explains this reversal? What happened in the Muslim world at the beginning working, then later on not working, and then what about Western Europe? So in a nutshell, the argument is that when Muslims had independent scholars, an independent merchant class, they had progress, development, and supremacy. At the time between 8th and 12th centuries, or 8th and 11th centuries, there were Muslim scholars called ulema who claim an independence from the government or the state, and which create a balance of power and give space to philosophers to flourish as well. And this ulema class, Islamic scholars, and some philosophers were funded by commerce. There was very strong merchant class. But after the 11th century, an alliance emerged, what I call an ulema state alliance, Islamic scholars and the military state. And this partnership marginalize intellectuals, marginalize merchants, and make Muslim world stagnant. In Western Europe, we saw almost the opposite. Until the 11th century, from the fall of Rome to the 11th century, for about 600 years, Europe did not have a merchant class, at least did not have an influential merchant class. Europe did not have an intellectual class. It was dominated by Christian clergy and military aristocracy. But after the 11th century, certain level of separation between church and state started to be institutionalized. A bourgeois class, an economic entrepreneur class emerged in Italian city-states such as Florence, Milan, Venice, Genoa, and others. And then the rest of Europe. And this bourgeois class worked together with an intellectual class, which was encouraged by the opening of universities in several European cities after the 11th century. So as you see, the existence of an independent intellectual class and independent economic class helped the Muslims' golden age, and the ulama-state alliance result in the decline in the Muslim world, whereas Europe had the reverse effect because it had a clergy-state partnership until the 11th century. Then some separation between the two and the emergence of intellectuals and bourgeoisie make what we call the rise of the West possible. And as you see, until the 11th century, Muslim supremacy, from 11th to 17th century, comparable level, and after the 17th century, Western supremacy. So now, this argument in a nutshell will be elaborated in the rest of the presentation, and then I will conclude by more contemporary debate and arguments. Historically, when we look at the Muslim Golden Age, the independent scholars, what I call them, is not only a religious class, ulama, but also philosophical class. So both Islamic scholars like Abu Hanifa and others established the well-known Islamic schools of law. They put a distance between themselves and the state authority. A well-known anecdote about Abu Hanifa is that when the Abbasi Caliph, the ruler of the time, asked him to be judge, he refused. He didn't want to be paid by state because Abu Hanifa was a merchant scholar. He was a silk merchant and an eminent alim, ulama class member. Then the ruler forced him and asked him to give a justification, an excuse why he refused to be judge. Abu Hanifa said, I am not qualified. Then the ruler said, you are a liar, you are the most qualified. Abu Hanifa replied, if I am a liar, I can never be judge. So the ruler was outraged, put him in prison, and then poisoned him to death. It wasn't a single example, but it was symbolizing a broad trend. As you see in the table now, Cohen's 1970 article analyzed 3,900 Islamic scholars between 8th and 11th centuries, showing that only 9% of them were civil servants paid by the state for official positions like judges. 91%, however, were privately funded. They were merchants or merchant family members and possessed other private jobs. Linking to today, from history to present, today, if we have such an analysis, we realize that maybe 90% of ulama are state servant now. It's very rare, maybe less than 10%, to see them privately funded, because today in Turkey's Diyanet, in Egypt's LSR, in Pakistan Sharia court, the Mullah class in Iran, they are all engaged with state. And this separation creates an intellectual dynamism where Muslims produce world-leading scholars of mathematics, optics, astrophysics, astronomy. For example, Khwarizmi established what we call algebra and algorithm. And wherever you find a word with al, it's likely to be Arabic originated. Even alcohol, because al means in Arabic da. So algebra and algorithm coming from Khwarizmi's writings, and Muslim mathematicians like him learn the Arabic numerals from India and then develop and taught them to Europeans. That's what we call them, Arabic numerals. And Europe didn't use zero before Muslims taught this system. So Razi was an eminent scholar who differentiated certain viruses and bacteria. Ibn Haytham established the first prototype of modern camera. Farabi was a political philosopher. Ibn Sina was a medical doctor. Biruni wrote an anthropological book on India and India's religion, tradition, culture, and history. So these eminent philosophers and polymaths were the productions and the pillars of Muslim Golden Age. But in the 11th century, things started to change because of multiple transformations. Economically, there was an agricultural crisis which weakened the budget and treasury of Abbasids. Therefore, the Abbasids and many Muslim rulers after them moved to what we call Iqta system of land revenue distribution. The state is now distributing lands to civil servants because they no longer have enough cash to pay the salaries. And this economic transformation meant a shift from a market economy, monetary based, to a semi-feudal system called Iqta. In addition to that, there was a religious transformation. As you see in this map, in the 11th century, Shia dynasties, military groups, and polities like Fatimids in Egypt and North Africa, Karmatis in Arabian Peninsula, Hamdanis, North Syria, Buyuts in Iraq and Iran, even holding Baghdad, they control entire Middle East and North Africa. And the Sunni Caliph Abbasi in Baghdad reacted to that by declaring a Sunni creed named after the Caliph Abdul Qadir. It's called Qadiri Creed, which define a Sunni orthodoxy, which wasn't defined that level before. According to the creed, Mu'tazili Muslim rationalist theologians are infidel. Certain Shia are infidel apostates. And the Caliph called all Sunni sultans, groups, come together to fight the enemies of Shia, rationalists, and philosophers. And this call was well received by a Turkic nomadic empire emerged called the Selçuks. And the Selçuks follow the ideological dimension of 11th century transformation and the rise of ulema-state alliance. The Sunni orthodoxy they embrace, especially the Qadiri creed of Caliph Abdul Qadir's claim. They follow the Iqta system, institutionalize the Iqta system, and they establish a military state based on the idea of conquest and conquering lands. And then we see the combination of structural factors, economic, religious structures, with agency, human agents, leaders. Abbasi caliphs leading the orthodoxy, Selçuk sultans leading a new military regime, and then Nizam al-Mulk, the Grand Vizier, the Prime Minister of the Selçuk Empire, established a chain of madrasas called after himself, Nizamiye madrasas. And these madrasas were indirectly funded by rulers, replaced the previous system of scholars receiving money from merchants. Now state control over economy make scholars also dependent on the state. And Nizamiye madrasas started to produce a certain type of ulama ready to serve the state. And the most famous production of that madrasa system was Ghazali, very famous Islamic scholar. And Ghazali and others justify this ulama-state alliance, saying that religion and state are twin. Religion is the foundation, state is the guardian. That without foundation collapses, that without guardian perishes. And they even claim that this statement about religion-state brotherhood is a hadith, a saying of Prophet Muhammad. In my book, I analyze this statement and emphasize that it's a Sasani maxim, an Iranian Persian proverb said much earlier than the Prophet, Centuries before the Prophet, a Sasani king said this statement that the religion and state are twins. This is not an Islamic Quranic verse or hadith, but it is a Sasani maxim, embrace and propagandate. And in order to make the propaganda deeper, post 11th century ulama define it as an hadith of the Prophet. In fact, it is not. So what is the result? The result is the marginalization of independent scholars, marginalization of merchants, with this Sunni orthodoxy, with semi-feudal economic system, with military bureaucracy, and very conservative madrasa system. So, one question before I conclude the history part is that, what about Mongols and Crusaders? Between 12 and 1400s, invaders, including Mongols and Crusaders, occupy Muslim lands, destroy libraries, killed millions of people. And I'm not exaggerating, the number is really millions. My answer to that is that yes, Mongols, Crusaders, Timur, these three groups of invaders were very influential negatively, but their impact was more indirect manner because they help unintentionally, as an unintended consequence, the strengthening of ulama-state alliance, the rise of ulama-state alliance, because when Muslims saw the destruction by the invaders, they turned to military leaders, they turned to religious preaching of ulama, they support ulama-state partnership, and the military heroes came in the form of very famous Saladin. And Saladin, as a military hero, defeated Crusaders, recaptured Jerusalem, but he also defeated the Shia Fatimids in Egypt, brought the Ulama State Alliance, which originally emerged in 11th century Central Asia, Iran and Iraq, and Saladin took that model and brought it to Syria and Egypt. And in Syria and Egypt, he established in the 12th century Ulama State Alliance. In the 13th and 14th century, this system spread all around the Muslim world, not everywhere, but in major part, especially in Middle East and North Africa. And then Saladin gave birth to a military oligarchy called Mamluks in Egypt. Mamluks became heroes too because they stopped the Mongol invasion of Egypt. And for centuries, they ruled Egypt and other parts of Middle East with a partnership between the military and the ulama. Ulama at that time produced a very eminent scholar in the late 13th, early 14th century called Ibn Taymiyyah. Today, Ibn Taymiyyah is well known as a forerunner and source of inspiration of Salafis and Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia. But he also played an important role in the Ulama State Alliance because there is nothing in Hadith for Ulama State Alliance and there is nothing in the Quran. But Ibn Taymiyyah said a key phrase in the Quran asking Muslim to obey Ulul Amr. It says, obey Ulul Amr minkum, those who have authority among you. And he says this verse referred to ulama and umara, ulama and the state rulers, despite the fact that the Quran doesn't refer to either ulama or the umara literally. So that's how Muslim world started to have a stagnation. One may say that, but still Muslims produce cutting-edge philosophers, 13th century Ibn Rushd, 14th and early 15th century Ibn Khaldun. That's correct. But at the same time, what we see, what happened to these eminent scholars, Ibn Rushd was a very important scholar and philosopher. He, in fact, taught Aristotelian philosophy to many Europeans indirectly. But in his country, Muslim Spain, Andalus, he was attacked. They define him as an apostate. He was put in exile, his books partially burned and destroyed. Ibn Khaldun was luckier. He wasn't directly targeted. He is an eminent scholar, regarded as the first social scientist. But he was forgotten. For centuries, he was forgotten until he was rediscovered by Europeans in the 19th century. So, and that's the position of scholars. And the position of merchants was not better because the Karimi merchants who were conducting intercontinental trade was marginalized by ulema state alliance. Mamluks expropriate certain of their possessions and properties. That's how the Muslim world faced a stagnant time. And this table shows, for example, in Egypt, how during the Golden Age between 8th and 11th centuries, the occupational terms like bank manager, like CEO, CFO, they had a large quantity, 233, but afterwards, with stagnation, with the Mamluk era, with ulema state alliance, they were almost frozen, slightly declined to 220. But when we look at the occupational terms of state and ulema, from around 100, they jumped to around 500. It shows the division of labor, resources, financial capacity of the ulama and state vis-a-vis the merchants from the Golden Age to stagnation. Another question asked to me, what about the Ottoman, Safavi, and Mughal empires, which were much more militarily powerful than Europeans? Why don't you consider them as Muslim Golden Age? I do not, because although these three empires, as you see in this map, were powerful, they meant a Muslim geopolitical recovery after the Mongol and Crusader invasions. But still, they don't mean an intellectual and economic recovery. These three empires were much less productive, scholarly and economically, in comparison to the early Islamic history and early Muslim Golden Era. Because these three empires were dominated by ulema state alliance, they were very late in embracing printing press and other technologies. Let me summarize the problem of that time. As you see, the rise of the West after Renaissance, when Europeans achieve Renaissance, Reformation, printing revolution, Enlightenment, scientific revolution, they use certain tools they learn from China: gunpowder, nautical compass, and printing press. And out of the three, Muslims only pick up and use gunpowder, because the Ottoman, Safavi, Mughal empires, we call them gunpowder empires, it was very important to use this military tool at the policy making table. There were military commanders deciding to embrace and use gunpowder, whereas there was almost nobody in the decision making table who understood the importance of printing press, because the intellectuals were marginalized, the economic bourgeoisie, economic entrepreneurs were not on the table, whereas in Europe, a strong bourgeoisie used printing for their capitalistic gains. Strong intellectual class also helped them to understand the value of printing. And what happened is that Europeans started to establish printing presses in 1455, and Muslims didn't have a single printing press until 1729. So 274 years, no printing press. Can you imagine today a country with no internet, or refused for over a century, over 2 centuries? The result is very negative in the Muslim world, because when we look at the estimate literacy rate in 1800, it was only 1% in the Muslim world, in the Ottoman Empire, while it was 31% in Western Europe. And now, during the Golden Age, Muslims, when we compare Golden Age and the later era, when Muslims had libraries of hundreds of thousands of books, Europeans had less than 1,000 books. But now in the Muslim world, 1% literacy in the Ottoman Empire for Muslims, 31% for Europeans. And finally, in the 18th century, when Ottoman Empire establishing a printing press, Ottomans printed only 50,000 copies of books, whereas in the same century, Europeans printed 1 billion books. So that explains how today we have a literacy gap, we have a socio-economic development gap between the Muslim world and the West, even between the Muslim world and world averages. Coming today, of course, colonization had a very negative impact. And in this map, I design in a way that you match colonizer like France color with colonized Muslim lands in West Africa, Russia with Central Asia, British color with India, and Spain and Spanish colonies. So, and then this had certain level of detrimental impact on Muslims, and this came, but this came much later than Muslim world already became stagnant as a result of ulama state alliance. And after colonization ended, of course, many Muslim reformists realized the problem of ulama state alliance. They really want to solve the problem by sidelining ulama. So, of course, I'm not the first one who pinpoint the problem. The problem is well known by Muslim reformists. But for various reasons, they were not very successful. One major reason, as I summarize here, is that in the last 200 years, many Muslim reformists, from Turkey's Atatürk to Egypt's Cemal Abdel Nasser, have mostly or to some extent failed in their modernist attempts because, similar to ulama state alliance, the secularist reformists were anti-intellectual and anti-bourgeoisie. They were very state-centric because they had a military background, because they saw bourgeoisie and intellectuals as problems for their top-down state-led modernization projects. And then later on, even this secular state compromise to the ulama, established new versions of ulama state alliance in Turkey, in Egypt. And then socio-political and legal Islamization in many Muslim majority countries came as a reaction. And Iranian revolution, of course, is a major symbol of the new era, what I would call Islamization. And during the last 50 years, Islamization, legal, social, political Islamization took place in many Muslim majority countries. And three groups, political Islamists, Sufi sheikhs, and of course ulama, played a role. And they revive certain level of ulama state alliance. And they need money. And money came from mostly oil. As you see in this table I prepared for rentier states, states that have government revenue coming from mostly oil, 40% or more coming from oil. And in the world, there are 28 oil-rich rentier states. And normally Muslims are only a quarter of all the countries. Therefore, they should have been 7 out of 28. But as you see in the table, they are 21. They are 3/4 of all rentier states. For various reasons, one historical baggage of underdevelopment, the other is geological reality that most oil reserves are Muslim countries. And these rents fueled ulama state alliance, using oil money in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in many other neighbors. Ulama state alliance established their authoritarian rules. So to conclude, Islam is not the culprit. There is a historical legacy of class relations, ulama class with the state class, and their partnership funded by oil and other revenues is the problem. Colonization is an important factor, but it was not the primary cause either. Institutions matter, but institutions are created by ulema state alliance. Institutions are not self-creating. They are made by ulema state alliance, which has both ideology and power to create that. So I'll be happy to answer if you have any questions.
Wonderful, Ahmet. Thank you very much for the uh, wonderful presentation here. Do an excellent job of giving us a lot of overview of the academic and scholarly contributions of some of the early Islamic states and civilizations, and then as best as can be done in the social sciences, dealing with messy human individuals and messy human societies, doing a big comparative analysis, and then really intricate deep reading of a lot of historical sources to pick out these details in a again, as best as can be done in the social sciences, a sort of controlled experiment to try to understand the reasons for these um, uh, lack of certain levels of development and political and economic development in a wide and varied region with a very diverse history as well. So it's very much appreciated. As we start with some questions here, I'll help moderate questions as well if anybody in the audience has those. Just a reminder here, if you look on your bottom indicators or your side indicators, you should see a chat cloud, or it looks like a talking cloud. You can click that and you can type in any questions in the chat board for Ahmet here. If we may, I can start with a question. I'd like to go back to your initial sample at the start of your talk, because your thesis here and your argument rests on a premise or a foundation that there is a problem, and the problem is that there is comparative lack of economic and political development in these indicators you talk about in the Muslim world. Um, if you look at indicators like GNI, schooling, literacy rate, these sorts of things that are obviously indicators, measures of human development, and we could also link those sometimes to indicators of economic development as well. Obviously, the Muslim world is a gigantic geographic and diverse area, as you showed us on the map. And there are countries in this sample, this large sample, that are, extreme ends of the spectrum, perhaps we could say. When we look across all nations of the world, there are, for example, nations like Qatar, UAE, that are sort of on the higher end of the development spectrum, if you will, at least economically. And then there are also perhaps nations on the more extreme lower end of all nations of the world, both economically and politically. Mali, Niger, Mauritania come to mind, for example. Um, Now you have an average, and of course that shows us that there is a problem with development in some ways because it is the average. Could you maybe speak to that a little bit? Just about, and maybe even some at the high end. Obviously, there's the oil revenue, of course, and the Gulf that especially influences the higher end. But just to sort of speak to your initial sort of contextualization of the problem and just how that speaks to sort of the diversity of the development range in the Islamic world, if that makes sense as a question. So.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. That's an excellent question, which helped me to elaborate certain points I went over quickly during the presentation, which is more historical emphasis. Now in the Q&A, maybe I can explain more contemporary data and analysis. First of all, you are right that in both development and democracy, we see certain level of variation, and how to explain this variation itself is an important question. In the book, I try to make it secondary because my primary goal was two comparisons. One comparison is the early Muslim era and today's Muslim era, to show Muslims and non-Muslims that we are talking about two different systems. That's why I didn't look at the variation within the early Muslim and contemporary Muslim. And the second, in order to emphasize the question, I look at the Muslim world average and the world average. But within the Muslim world, there is a variation in terms of both democracy development. When the book was published, a major question I received was, for example, Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim majority country, and which is a democracy with certain problems. It's not a liberal democracy, but still it is called a democracy, much more open society than Middle East regimes. And interestingly, as a result of this openness and dynamism, the Indonesians pick up the book very early, translate in 1 year, and then now it is fifth edition, which is good that this outlier get an engagement with me and my argument. So here is the brief reflection. I went there 3 months ago. I was in Indonesia discussing with intellectuals and scholars what went right in Indonesia while things getting certain level of wrong in the Middle East and some parts of the Muslim world. First of all, there is a very much separation between ulama and state. Nahdlatul Ulema Muhammadiyah, two Muslim organizations claiming millions of followers, 90 million and 30 million, very big. They have their own funding. They are not receiving money from state. They have their own governance. They elect their leaders in an open way. So therefore, there are democratic Muslim countries. What makes them democratic is definitely a more open understanding of society with less partnership between ulama states. In Indonesian case, the fact that they elect their leaders, this is a more participatory and bottom-up organization, which is nice. Economically, for example, Indonesia was a strong military dictatorship until 1990s with oil money. Today, it's no longer oil exporting country. It is now oil importing, no more oil rent, which also help democracy and development. Another region you refer to, West Africa. Mali, Senegal, Niger, yes, they are not very economically developed, but democratically they are better than Middle East, at least Senegal. And interestingly, when we compare Muslim majority countries in sub-Saharan Africa with Christian majority countries, Muslim majority countries have better democracy scores and better criteria of religious coexistence, diversity, and toleration. And therefore, sub-Saharan Africa is an important laboratory to analyze Islam and Christianity and see how they are contextual, how context matter. So therefore, to answer your important question briefly, yes, there are much more democratic Muslim countries than the authoritarian cases, and more developed than less developed. And one is Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia. The other is West Africa, especially Senegal. The third one is Balkans. Albania, Kosovo, Bosnia are more democratic than Middle East and Central Asian republics or dynasties. Again, we see less level of ulama-state alliance in all three corners, less oil resources in three corners, and more engagement with democracies for Albania, Kosovo, and Bosnia. It's important to be in Europe, close to Western European democracies. So all these factors important. What I'm trying to emphasize in the book and the presentation is that ideas coexist with material conditions. So therefore, we cannot simply blame Islam, Christianity, or a particular ideology for authoritarianism and underdevelopment, because ideas and contexts shape and affect each other.
It's an excellent point, and to go off of that a little bit, it goes actually into another question I had specifically about democracy. You mentioned you elaborated a lot on the Indonesia example where you just were a few months ago. Um, the so you argue in some ways against what is classically called the essentialist sort of argument about Islam being incompatible with democracy. We see that's clearly not true, especially with again, Indonesia being obviously the biggest population example, of course. Um, Islam does play obviously, it does place into your story, of course, because of the history of the religion in the region. Um, I mean, maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit in the sense that how, you specified some of the mechanisms how Islam did play into the marginalization of the uh, the independent scholarship, these sorts of things, in some of the interpretation that some of the various actors had, at various points. Um, you know, again, it does play a role here. It's not obviously the key factor, of course, but there is some influence here. So maybe you could speak to, if possible, to speak to that a little bit about what role the actual religion or the interpretation of the Quran, these sorts of things, specific within the religion, do play in your story, I suppose, in your argument.
Thank you, Brandon. This is also a very important $1 million question. So, first of all, I am not promoting the true Islam in the book. So, I was in Berlin last month, and in Leipzig and Berlin, they kept asking me, aren't you promoting your own Islam? I said, no, because in the book, I'm trying to emphasize that when multiple interpretations of Islam were permitted, Muslims had a dynamic life. They produce scholarly, philosophical, and economic innovations and productions. Once orthodoxy, Sunni orthodoxy in the Muslim world, Shia orthodoxy in Shia majority countries like Iran, eliminate alternatives, they kill intellectual dynamism. So therefore, rather than the content of a single religion, the important thing whether alternatives are allowed to exist and engage. Even a very liberal ideology, if imposes itself by shouting down freedom of speech and alternative critical thinking, it could eventually lead to a dictatorial regime and intellectual stagnation. So, for example, among the four Sunni mazhab, I find Hanbali too conservative for my personal taste. But if they exist as one of the multiple alternative schools, they enrich the discussion unless they establish an orthodoxy. That's one point. The second direct point to your question, of course, certain Islamic ideas or certain interpretations or proto-Islamic or pseudo-Islamic ideas, which are not really Islamic but labeled as Islamic, are part of the problem. For example, the idea that religion and state are twins, and then they say this is Islamic hadith, Prophet Muhammad saying, even if it is not, many people believe it is, then it is an important part of problem. Or for example, in my book, there is a chapter on violence. I analyze how Salafi jihadi ideology lead to violence by many Muslim terrorist organizations. So we cannot deny that certain interpretation of Islam serve violence, promote authoritarianism, and hinders development. So here the question is, what kind of open system we can create that these bad interpretations can be challenged by alternatives, more egalitarian alternatives? And also, how come they establish an hegemony? There are so many discussions in the book. For example, today, Salafi Wahhabi interpretation of Islam is one of the most rigid. And in the last century, it affected many countries and individuals. By the fact that Saudi Arabia promoted as official religion until very recently, now they claim that they stopped preaching in a rigid, radical way. We'll see. But they control oil and Mecca, Medina. So non-Muslims may ask, you the Muslims, why did you allow a radical interpretation of Islam control your two holy cities and oil reserves? My answer is that we Muslims didn't allow. It was Britain that kicked out Ottoman Empire from Mecca, Medina, then gave the green light to Saudis to defeat Sharif Hussein and establish a Wahhabi regime in Mecca, Medina. So therefore, I'm not just blaming Britain and British colonization. I'm saying that, yes, certain interpretation of Islam are problems, but these problems promoted by multiple factors like Britain in Saudi Arabia or United States in Afghanistan, promoting Afghan jihad against Soviet Union. And here, when we say certain interpretations in Afghanistan are problematic, yes, they are. And I'm writing against blasphemy laws, apostasy laws, and certain interpretations of Islam. But we should also put them in an international context.
And you're leading perfectly into all these questions I had because the next one I was going to have was you speak very well in part of your answer here about the you know the that there is obviously if it were to be allowed to flourish more pluralism and all of these other things within the Islamic much of the Islamic world, um, because of the oil revenue and these other things that have gone to a lot of the kingdoms and the sort of authoritarian, if we want to call the kingdoms and authoritarian systems. um, yeah, a lot of people may think that those systems are just fine given that the economic development is there. And so and this is me playing devil's advocate. I don't you know I'm very much a pro-democracy person, as is our audience, I think, of course, watching. But that said, to play devil's advocate for a second, could you extend the argument for why democracy is important in this
Yeah,
region,
sure, sure.
and maybe more generally? Because again, there is yes, there is a lot of public support in many ways, as you cited earlier, for democracy in a sort of general sense when people are polled about it. But how much it is there is also, I suppose, questionable as well. But it's so, and given again the economic development that we do see in some of the kingdoms where there is not a democratic system, can you make the argument
Sure,
a little bit further to why democracy is vital
sure.
in the region?
Yeah. Let's start first a hypothetical question whether I am imposing an American agenda to the Middle East and Muslim world, because it's not hypothetical. I asked me in Tokyo, a Japanese professor said, with this project, you are imposing American agenda to Muslims. I said, I wish there was an American agenda, American foreign policy to promote democracy in the Middle East. There is no such policy or consistent project. First of all, it's not. As you said, and I referred to in the presentation, when Muslims ask, by and large, they support democracy. And what do they mean by democracy? First of all, if we take basic questions in the book, peace, not violence, freedom, not oppression, and development, not underdevelopment, most people in the Muslim world would agree, especially when they are persecuted. They say, where is freedom? For example, in Turkey today, there is an authoritarian government persecute various groups, Kurds, some leftists, some religious groups, etc. And most of these persecuted people seek refuge in European democracies. They can't go to African Asian autocracies because these African Asian autocracies either give them back to Turkish government or didn't even accept that. So why democracy matter? As an individual, I want freedom. And when individuals are asked, they want freedom in the Muslim world too. And popularity of the dictators are very low. That's why they don't allow open elections. And Arab Spring was also an opportunity for us to see how people really are willing freedom and equality and justice in their understanding. So in this regard, what I point as the problem of authoritarianism, I think it's a universal problem that most people agree on. And let me conclude by that. Democracy today is so strong that even dictators define themselves as democrat. I live in Turkmenistan in 1999. They had a very authoritarian leader, Turkmenbashi, and this guy are so authoritarian that when he talked, the ministers were standing up and writing down whatever he said. They cannot even sit down with him. He said that Turkmenistan is the most democratic country. Today, the apologists of China say China is very democratic. So it's very difficult to autocrats to say, yes, autocracy is better than democracy. They say, we are more democratic than you.
it's it's an excellent point, excellent points there, and I've actually taught about Turkmenistan a few times, and
Okay.
maybe one of the only faculty at my college to mention Turkmenbashi a few times in my courses because of the talk about a colorful that's a polite word for it, dictator. We could have a whole conversation on him, I suppose. No, it's you know, again, done very done an excellent job of how to say, looking at the historic sources of Islam and also looking at all of these different sort of components and diversity within it, and done a very good job of sort of, I would be surprised that anybody accused you of promoting your own version of Islam, because you've done an excellent job with, again, such a deep history of it. Do you have a time for a couple more questions,
Yes,
Ahmet, if
yes,
that's
sure.
okay?
Of
Okay.
course. Yeah, I'll be happy.
I wanted to get more. I did more of these more generalized, bigger picture inquiries, I suppose, but more to the specific thesis of your book, um, which is, so you argue for the importance of the an independent scholarly and business class, if I may summarize a little bit. Um, are there are there any sort of prescriptions for current governments or current situations? Obviously, there are many different nations within your sample. Of course, you could pick one or two or whatever you think is appropriate out of that. Uh, what would be your prescriptions for policy reform, for leadership change, for what would it take for for the region to be, to have more these sort of levels of development that you're ideally wanting to see? Would it be pure policy? Would it be something else? What obviously the Ulema State Alliance here is, if you can speak to how, what can practically be done, I
Hmm.
suppose.
Hmm.
Maybe we
Yeah,
can open the
this
discussion.
is also an excellent question. I think, first of all, the solution is really long term, bottom up, starting with individuals, convincing them, if necessary, one by one. About what? About first the existence of the problem. Because you can always see the half of the glass full or half of the glass empty. In Turkey, there will be an election in a month. And as I referred to, there is a government which is authoritarian and almost failed on development too. But when you ask the followers and supporters, they say it's better than Syria. Syria has civil war. You see, this level of relativism, this level of justifying what is happening is the first problem. First, we should diagnose the problem itself, admit as Muslim society members, etc., that yes, something need to be fixed. This next step is to stop blaming Islam or Western imperialism, because these two really froze many minds. They either say it's all about Islam and they became anti-religious but nothing else, or they keep referring to United States, Europe, and even the earthquake. They say America may have a weapon to trigger earthquake, etc. So when we go over this step, we reach the level to appreciate intellectuals and economic entrepreneurs. And for that, we need freedom of speech and protection of property rights. I think these two, freedom of speech and the protection of property rights, are crucial. That's why I spent much time in the last 3 years to write against blasphemy and apostasy laws in the Muslim world. Blasphemy and apostasy laws or other forms of restricting freedom has a long-term devastating impact, very negative. So my solution here is really challenge these restrictions and convince everyone that freedom of speech is not a luxury. It's a way of development and the progress, and protection of property rights, which is violated constantly because of very strong statist mentality justified by religion. So therefore, My personal humble contribution to the solution is to put both the ulama and state and their partnership under the spot and show people that here there is a problem here, and then ask for an open society where intellectuals and bourgeoisie can flourish.
And this then maybe goes into what could be our perhaps final question. You outlined here the importance of property rights, freedom of speech, these various rights. Are there, you've obviously traveled a lot in the region, you're from the region. Do you see any glimmers of hope in any of this, again, wide spectrum of places? Mentioned Indonesia, of course, is functionally democracy essentially and has been for at least some time. Could we point to any areas, any points uh, in the area that are maybe glimmers of hope going forward?
Yes,
We could
so
end on a positive note in that way.
of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Very briefly then, as a country, Indonesia is very dynamic and a very diverse society, an important reason to be hopeful for. But overall, there are reasons to be hopeful for the Muslim world because from 1920s to 70s, there was a secularist trend creating certain problems, brought its reaction of Islamization from 70s to today. And now, Islamism and Islamization is creating its own reaction. That's what I saw in the Iranian women and men revolting or protesting. And in Turkey, there is a growing reaction to ulama state alliance Erdogan is trying to build. In Egypt, there is a strong resistance oppressed by the military regime now. But in all of these important countries, we may see a new generation critical of the state, critical of their clergy, ulama, and open to discuss what is wrong and what is possible to do. That's why, in fact, my book has been picked up by many young people in different countries, translated because they want an open discussion. So that makes me hopeful that in terms of ideas, a transformation now happening, Islamism creating a major disappointment, plus economically, oil reserves are depleted. Even if they still exist, a new energy sources make them replace. You know the joke that Stone Age end before the end of stones, and Oil Age may end before the end of oil. And this will make state less powerful economically. You may see much diversity. And today, Saudi Arabia, for example, why they try to change? Because they know, they see that oil end is coming to an end. So these are the reasons for me to be hopeful about the future of the Muslim world.
It is appropriate at a college talk to talk about the next generation, and of course, this is as you younger folks are here and listen to this. It's also the young folks in the Islamic world as well that can certainly have an impact when generational changes occur. We can certainly see, political dynamism and that those types of shifts occur as well. So as we've seen through history. You've summarized well, Ahmet. So Ahmet, thank you so much for being here this afternoon. This is a wonderful resource for our students and faculty, and you've done such an intricate and unique history here of the region, and so a dynamic argument, and give us a lot to think about the not only the development of the Islamic world, but also the potential future of it as well. So we really thank you for the contributions today and coming and joining us. So
Thank you, Brandon, and it was my pleasure. And the questions were truly excellent and really helped me rethink many issues. Thank you so much.
all right, thank you, Ahmed, and thank you everybody for joining us on the RCBC Global Studies Lecture Series, and we'll see you all next time. So take care, everybody.